Alright, let's take a look at Bloodtree Rebellion here. It's the final look. And yeah, I'm wearing what I think space farmer rebels on this planet would wear, and I assume they'd smoke a calabash because it's made out of a blood tree or something. Calabashes are very hard pipes to smoke. The problem is that I've had a couple of them. The weight of the stone piece drags down, so it's hard to keep in your mouth, and you kind of want to brace it here. I've had them break very often near the stem area, so you have to keep it kind of supported all the time, which is kind of weird. Okay, what about the game? In my intro, I talked a little bit about how there were some reminders between this and Nick Karp's Vietnam. I find it very difficult to believe. Karp's game is such a masterpiece, and I've often looked at it and said, my God, where did all this come from? Well, some of it seems to have come from here. I find it very difficult to believe that Mr. Karp did not play this at some point and at least trigger some of the ideas. Now, this is maybe at least as innovative as Vietnam is in terms of looking at it, but it doesn't fit together quite as well nor work quite as well. It's not, you know, it's not that kind of masterpiece. But you have to remember when Karp designed that, I think he was like 18 years old. He was in his freshman year of college or something like that. And it's just astounding how good that game is in so many ways. But this is a very, very interesting game. It includes some really, really cool aspects to it. So, component-wise, you know, it's old school GDW. It's nothing to be too excited about, but it appears to be largely effective, except that there's not sufficient player aids. Given the way the rules are, and especially if somebody's going to highlight them, it's really not effective for you know, conveying the information that you need when you're playing the game itself. You have to flip through these constantly. There's a lot of exceptions, etc., and a lot more of that could be moved into some quick reminder notes. I might do that if and when I get back. I probably will, to trying to play this, especially opposed with someone. Try to give them a feel for it. But one of the things that's really cool, and it's a Vietnam aspect, is not the organizational chart in and of itself, but the fact that you've got these breakdown units that you can, you know, largely create the unit you need at the time. Now, this game probably has some issues. It has a lot of issues in the rules themselves in terms of things that are left a little fuzzy. So, in one of the cases is that these breakdowns are allowed at any time, and if that's truly taken to be an absolute, you can really kind of get around the game's intent by screwing with that. You know, oh, I'm being attacked, I break down into littler units, so I'm not going to take, you know, as much casualty because either way he's got 6-1 on me. You could actually make an argument that that might be the intent. There's no question there. But it gives you too many decisions, and in a lot of ways there may be way too many for me in this game already. The other really neat thing, and this is not in Vietnam, but I've heard it maybe in one of the Algeria games, is this breakdown of cities into sort of a political map, and the use of these little political counters, both actions and power chits, to kind of help dominate the cities. And that is a really, really neat aspect to the game. I don't know how much real strategy there is in it. In a sense, it almost feels like things just fall in a certain way eventually. Things just start happening in the cities. But it's a nice mechanism to kind of let you watch that happening in more detail than you would see in most games that just have, you know, maybe a simple track for the cities or whatever. Also, the concept of the manpower. When you take casualties, you take them off your manpower, your reserve manpower. So units don't actually get destroyed, but you destroy units or remove them, depending on the situation. Well, essentially they get destroyed and get eaten up for manpower. So if you're taking, if you take partial losses on a large unit, that large unit doesn't just dissolve. Instead, you can dissolve some unit elsewhere to give it replacements. That's kind of neat concept. It works okay in the game. There's a little bit of fiddliness to that, and as well as with the city, the political in the city, that may turn some people off a good deal. Combat chart. This is definitely GDW here. Losses based on how big you are. You attack with a bigger unit, you're going to take larger losses. Now here the percentage losses don't stick to the unit as they did in a lot of GDW games. Instead they're taken from those manpower reserves. You have to pay that cost, and if you don't pay that cost, you pay the whole unit. Terrain, oh god, the terrain is so weird in this because of for a number of reasons. Basically, you have different kinds of units, so many different kinds of movement, where the guerrillas are using kind of a ground movement usually, although they're capable of using anti-grav. The Mycan are using anti-grav movement, but then there's vehicles that each have their own tracked, and hovercraft have their own types of movement that are different from those, and it just kind of makes you scream when you try to track that, and nowhere near enough information is given on this chart. This is probably the play that's the least effective to me. The other thing that's painful is when you're looking for the effects on the popular will in the cities, this is difficult to approach. It's just hard to find the things you want to find. I'm not sure how it could be organized better, but I find myself scanning through and not being able to find the things that I really need to see at any given point. The rules are the same way. The graphic layout of the rules, trying to ignore the blue stuff, is these solid paragraphs that are fairly long, kind of reminiscent of GMT actually, although there's 3 columns instead of 1 or 2 or whatever GMT tends to use. It's very hard to find what you want in it. I found generally GDW is a little easier to approach than GMT rules, but in this particular case, maybe because of the blue stuff, maybe because there's so many exceptions in this for different kinds of things, and things aren't well organized within the rules, I found this particularly difficult. Maybe one of the more difficult games that I've faced that's not really that complex a game when you actually look at it. He manages, Lynn Willis manages to get this thing down in 12 pages. Now, in part, it may be a certain sparseness. Things are only said once, and there's not an organizational overhead in terms of case numbers and spacing and stuff. So, some of that is probably what manages to keep the rulebook small. Let's look at the different things. I've already kind of talked about the political phase in one of the later vids that I was covering. I was talking about the counter draw aspect. That's really necessary because otherwise somebody can sit on the counters that you need. So you have this ability to constantly be pulling from what they have, and so they can't hoard the stuff that is important to you. And since the counters generally are only usable by one player for an active action, that's kind of important. And also, since in some cases certain counters counter a counter the other person can play immediately, by drawing from them you might be taking away their ability to negate your usage. So there's a lot of shake-up in there. Maybe, not as... yeah, it's a fair amount of shake-up. And that shake-up could conceivably disrupt your plans. So, for example, if you went in and knocked someone out of a power base so that you could, I don't know, assassinate it, you end up in this position where they might draw either your assassination for it or might be able to play something which triggers other power bases or whatever, kind of how we saw this huge domino collapse on the last turn of the game or second to last turn? Last turn of the game, I think. Everything just fell at once. And it was just kind of like, well, it's over. You know, I mean, I don't know what to do now. The guerrillas just took it all at once. What about reinforcements? So the guerrillas have this reinforcement capability which is involved in going out in the wilderness and recruiting stuff. Whereas the Mycan reinforcements are off-planet or out in the archipelago or whatever, and they have to roll to get them. And they have certain restrictions. If they're rolling to get them, they can't do other things, at least not until these guys are in the game. We didn't even see those guys come in or do anything. I thought about using some of them some of the times. But, yeah. And then the movement combat, well, what's kind of neat here, so the probing and the hops and stuff like that, that's very much like Vietnam. Vietnam has that kind of different words used, but that kind of, hey, I gotta find a VC unit and it might jump away before I can attack it. And then once I attack it, I can start bringing reinforcements in. This has a clumsier system and shows a little less detail. So I might blunder into the unit and get into a firefight with it automatically. But in Vietnam, you have to pin the unit down with some fire to begin with. You have to fight it initially and then call in your reinforcements. I like the view that Vietnam gives better than the view that this gives. But again, that concept seems to have been refined and put in the other game. That would be my guess. The idea of dummy and farmer counters, and the fact that hitting these farmer counters can cause kind of a popular discontent when you shoot up a bunch of farmers. That's really a nice feature. That doesn't get quite covered in Vietnam. What does is the free fire versus the panic fire in this. Panic fire in this is similar. It's, hey, you're calling the big guns in that, you know, hit territory indiscriminately. It seems to be actually associated with the infantry, the Mycan infantry, that they're just carrying this like nuclear weaponry or something in this, which is a little different. But you have the free fire zones in Vietnam, which also, both these things kind of affect support. Now here, popular support isn't really affected by shooting up a bunch of guerrillas with over much firepower, but it does affect the native aliens here, and that's kind of neat. The casualty and the manpower, yeah, that goes right into Vietnam. Vietnam has the replacement points. The difference between the two games, this one's much more flexible. If I need to take casualties, I can plop another unit off the board and reinforce my current unit so it can take the casualties. And in my off-board, you know, my casualty pool. In Vietnam, you have to keep those numbers up. There was another game that I saw recently. I mean, maybe not recently, but that I was aware of that used something like that. Well, La Grande Guerre uses something like that actually, as well, where you have to keep certain manpower reserves up in place, or else you're going to start losing real things, if I recall correctly. It's been a while since I played it, so I'm not sure. You'd think that would stick in my head to how much I love that game. But maybe I'm thinking something else. Maybe I'm thinking another World War I game that I should put up there, which is the Great War. And World War I as well has that kind of, if you don't have points to spend for things. Now, World War I is going to be the oldest, probably the oldest of the games that, that's a couple of years before this, that uses that kind of, hey, you've got a pool of manpower in reserve or a pool of casualty capabilities that if you don't have those anymore, you get in trouble. I like in this that you don't get in trouble, that you don't have to try to estimate how many points that you can take in casualties. I find that somewhat more appealing to me for whatever reason. You've got so many little special weapons here. You've got the hover tanks, you've got the gun plats, you've got the TEDx, the sand guide. All these things do special stuff. Some of them affect the terrain that they're on, the bomb, the big bomb. Some of them can blow up the terrain and change it, you know, significantly, at least within one hex. And that's an interesting feature, being able to make massive changes to the terrain that you're fighting over. Sort of like you would expect defoliation to work in Vietnam, except here you're not sending planes in, and also it's actually effective. It actually clears out the hex. The hexes can be completely turned clear by, which obviously it's the same kind of thinking as behind defoliation, but here it is actually having a long-term effect on the game. There's some real random stuff in it, like when does the PO, the Petrochem Orionid, come into play on the side of the Mikan. By the way, when I was playing, I lamented that there's no PO power base counters. I think those get added when the PO enters the game. I'm not sure, and I'm not going to hunt through the rules to try to see what's up with that. But there were some counters that got removed. A couple of demonstration counters. No, a couple of arrest counters and the PO control markers. I think those must get put back into play, and I failed to do so. No biggie. They probably would have ended up in the guerrillas' hands anyway. The changing weather. Oh, now this is weird. So again, somewhat reminiscent of what you'd think would belong in a Vietnam War game, and I've heard hints that this was made, if anybody knows for sure, I've heard people claim that this was made as a Vietnam game initially, and then the decision was made nobody would want to play Vietnam in '77. Well, these tuber things are kind of like rice paddies or something. They get flooded out and turned into just, you know, this total water terrain. Now, that's fine for most of the units, but there are some things that have trouble with that. But then when the water drains away and they're dry, well, instead of like a rice paddy, which probably becomes mostly like kind of maybe clear terrain, maybe kind of a lightly rough terrain, I don't know. But you've got these huge trees everywhere, these tuber trees in this valley, and it becomes, you know, worse than a forest. It becomes very, very difficult to move through and very troubling to some of the units. The movement itself is largely unlimited for the Mikan player, but the guerrilla has to deal more on the ground because he can't fly without taking a risk there. We didn't arrest anyone, so there weren't any prison breaks. We saw the desertion of the PO troops as they flipped sides. That was kind of a cool factor there. And I guess that's about it in terms of the different factors in the game. This is, you know, to me, this is sort of such a weird... It was very, very hard as I was playing to kind of get a grasp on what I should be doing. I was blundering constantly about, both through the rules, which obviously is problematic, but, you know, it is a first playing. But also, just with the idea of, what the hell do I do? You know, I mean, I know what my end of game victory conditions are. Those are pretty simple. At the end of the game, I must have a route going through. But, you know, what do I need to do to prevent the guerrillas from being able to disrupt the farm materials for one turn? Because that's all that it matters. And thinking about it at this point, I'm having a hard time coming up with a strategy that's likely to work there. What we saw was a complete collapse of the Mikans. Both first on the field, they were destroyed in the wilderness areas, then near the cities, and finally the cities themselves just turned all at once, in part because of me letting the hover tanks fall. Obviously, you can garrison those hover vehicles, the not hover tanks, but these huge hover platforms that carry the goods. Once they get destroyed, first of all, they cause some popular support by being destroyed to go over to the guerrillas. But then also, there's a 45 point, basically, 100 points is a major shift in the popular support. So about half a major shift each turn for just having to impress the local populace to move their to start moving the supplies. You also lose a bunch of militia that support the Mycan that would be available otherwise. So I feel like I screwed up big time by letting that fall early. In turn 2, I think, or 3, and it could have gone earlier. I just didn't protect those. I didn't see how valuable they were because I couldn't see that I could hold them out till the end of the game. But each turn, I have to try to bring the food home, and therefore each turn I have to either provide the hover tank or the hover transport connection, or I have to impress the local natives into carrying the goods. That was one of the things that I think heavily tilted the game towards the guerrillas. But even without that, the guerrillas pretty much have a free hand towards building up their forces in the wilderness. I don't think they actually have to do much in the early stages of the game in terms of trying to disrupt things if they don't want to. And that means it's up to the Mycans to try to disrupt the growth of the guerrillas, and that is tough. If I cheated in favor of the Mycan there by allowing their gunplats to fly out, their hovercraft to fly out and engage some things that they probably shouldn't have been able to. I think I could be more careful with the Mycan and lose less early, but I would have killed less of the guerrillas. They would have built up quicker and been able to cause more damage early. And that means that some of those big guerrilla units would be hiding there, and they'd end up causing the panic fire to happen more often. Now, what actually happened was I cheated there as well. The panic fire happened where it shouldn't have a couple of times, and then never happened again, because basically the Mycan were out of firepower by that point. All in all, it's definitely something I'd like to look at some more to see if I can, if it is actually a balanced and interesting game, or if not, what little tweaks I can make to make it work a little better and make it more competitive. What needs to be done? There's easy ways to do it. You could do a bidding on the number of forests needed, which, that could go down to you only have to carry Robachi Put, essentially, in its surrounding territory if you bid very low. And I think if that is your goal, if you're bidding low enough and getting the Mycan, it's probably pretty easy to win. So then the question becomes, okay, how much beyond that initial, that baseline do you have to go? So I think there are ways of making the game balanced if it is indeed unbalanced. And I'm not sure that it is. I was blundering around both with the rules and with my strategy pretty heavily on it. Anyway, I'm pretty damn happy to have a copy of it. Unhappy that it has blue highlighter all over it, but I don't know if photocopying. See, I don't remember if photocopiers cancel that out, but I might be able to reconstruct the rules. Unfortunately, the rules themselves probably need a rewriting. They're pretty damn bad to begin with. Possibly correct, largely, but really hard to access, and especially as a reference. You can read through them and say, oh, that all makes sense, but more than I would have handled. But anyway, this is very, very intriguing little game.